First of all, I would like to start off by warmly welcoming each and every one of you to today's conference on Africa and the African Union in shaping the future of peacekeeping and the Peacebuilding Architecture review. I would like to thank the Embassy of Canada, whose funding partnership made the convening of this event possible. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ben Mark, for the collaboration with Amani Africa. I would also like to thank His Excellency El Ghasim Wan, who, along with Professor Paul Williams, led the United Nations commissioned a study on peacekeeping, which is expected to shape and inform policy thinking, including the upcoming peacekeeping ministerial that is being held in Germany next May. We are in a time of major volatility and uncertainty, both globally and here on the African continent as well. And the state of things, particularly in terms of peace and security, is one that certainly requires more, the use of more instruments in terms of peacekeeping and peace enforcement. There is a space here. Okay. But we are also at a time when the fundamentals on which the planning, mandating, designing, and deploying peacekeeping are facing major strains for a number of reasons, among which is the change in the nature of conflicts, but also the shifts in power relations, both globally, but also here on the African continent. Other continent where many of the peacekeeping operations of the UN are deployed, and a continent where some of the most interesting developments around peacekeeping have been shaped and been informed by, including in terms of partnership, for example. Africa has a major stake in the future of peacekeeping, and indeed in how peace building and the peacebuilding architecture would be reviewed and implemented in the years to come. So my role today is just to say we are very grateful and we thank those of you who would be leading the peacekeeping ministerial debates in May, including Germany, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Ambassador General Charles is here, Rwanda. We are very happy for your kind presence today. We look forward to your contribution. Once again, thank you very much for your presence. I now call on Ambassador Ben Mark, the permanent representative of Canada to the African Union, for joining us here for a welcoming remark. Ambassador Ben.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Salman, my dear brother. And okay, let me check last time my notes. Okay, I think I'm good. So, dear Excellencies and colleagues here, I just want to say good morning to everybody, and thank you for having convening for this meeting this morning. I think it's timely we're having this conversation. And when I was coming here, I was thinking about what that meant for me today to be here. And, you know, I'm coming from a place where, let's say, conflict, armed conflict is not a discussion. If you're born in Canada or if you live in Canada, this discussion about peace building and something seems weird to you. But it's not weird when you can see the hardship of the others. So I like the discussion about having policies to set boundaries, to at least think about something we can do to help the situation right now. Because we're starting the second decade in the hard way of the Agenda 2063, which bother me a lot. Because we are thinking about the second decade will be the one we're going to start everything. But now we have to think about the conflict, the crisis. And people here on this room are working very hard to make it less harder. But we know everything about these conflicts, their roots, their root causes. And we have to work on this one too. And we have to work on making sure that the next generation who is coming don't think that we have to be in war to solve problems. And for me, policies are good, but we still have to be out there and talking. I just want to make sure we can have touch on this thing. If we have youth on this room, what will they say to us? The women, because people are suffering out there. So it's not just about our policies or boundaries we want to set here or review the mechanism and everything. For us, as partner on this continent and partner of your organization, is to push for more peace. I mean, we need peace to move on. And I think we can do it. And I can't wait to see what the review will do to us today. And I can't wait to go out there and say that people are still thinking about making peace. And there is mechanism, and not let the cynicism get the system for us. So I congratulate everybody who's come to this morning. Thank you, Excellencies. A couple of friends are here, and Canada is very keen to help, I think, on mediation, on means, resources. We know that resources is important for this kind of job, and we're very ready to help. So have a good time. Let's discuss. Let's be frank, because out there people are suffering, and let's make the policies count. I thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ben. Once again, I wish to acknowledge with appreciation the collaboration between the Canada Mission to the African Union and Amani Africa. I would like to now call upon Her Excellency Ambassador Hirut Zemene, Permanent Representative of Ethiopia to the African Union, for her to make her remarks. Ambassador, please.
Good morning, everyone. All protocols observed. I would like to start by appreciating Amani Africa for bringing us together for this very important conference that is very timely and that talks about peace and security of the world, not only of Africa. I would also like to appreciate the theme picked to focus on the African situation, the African position in terms of, peacekeeping and peace-building operations around the world. I'm sure all of you know that Ethiopia is a staunch supporter of collective security. It has done so when it was a member of the League of Nations in the early 1920s, although it was a very difficult experience, as you know, Ethiopia being the only Black country in the League of Nations. And then Ethiopia is also a founding member of the United Nations. And through this, strong support for collective security, it has also laid with the founding fathers of our continent, the OAU, the precursor of the African Union. And, peacekeeping operations are very important, have been important for many, many years now. And you would recall that Ethiopia is one of the top troop contributing countries in the world. And its experience begins even in early 50s, where it started from Korea, and then many countries, over 10 countries that it has served. In partnership, of course, this is a little contribution that we can offer to keep peace and to collaborate, to ascertain a better future for our world. In doing this, there have been many initiatives and collaborations around the world due to its position as one of being the largest troop contributing countries. As Dr. Solomon earlier said, it also partake on the sessions that come together on our part. Usually our defense ministers participate, and we look forward to the May event in Berlin. Now, the most important thing is that, as has been mentioned, we've been hearing lately that there's a tectonic shift in the global situation. There's a lot to ponder about how to keep the traditional way of peacekeeping operations. Of course, whether it is preventive diplomacy, whether it is peacekeeping or enforcement. We don't know whether enforcement has worked at all, but we have had that framework in the continuum nexus. So in this connection, I think it's very important to look into our review for peacekeeping and peace building, the fact that we have succeeded in launching Resolution 2719, assess contributions for peace operations in Africa. But however, we know that we are suffering from lack of financing. It's a big issue. We're saying innovative financing. I hope that this conference will review this magical word of innovative financing. We hear it everywhere. What does it mean? How do we achieve it? In the context of Africa, Ethiopia has joined the Peace and Security Council this year. We will hope that we'll contribute by learning from our predecessor countries. And then also, of course, it's not our first time in joining, to see what we can do. But we believe that we have to pick we have to see a light at the end of the tunnel. In this way, we have to appreciate the initiative taken by the African Union in carving out its role, of course, in a little way, but it's very encouraging to see that we have now the Peace Fund. The Peace Fund has met its goals, but is it enough? It's not enough. So we are speaking about innovative way of financing, how to augment this initial 400 million US dollars that we have made effectively, but it's not enough. So I have our distinguished ambassadors here that we're working with here. I see Sierra Leone, distinguished ambassador of Sierra Leone, who is also serving in the United Nations Security Council as the A3 member. I have spoken your ambassador, I've heard your ambassador speaking in Oran. It was a very, very interesting experience. And then also I see my brother from Rwanda, General Ambassador. I'm sure their contributions, and all of us, of course, this is a conference, will be very interesting. But it would be remiss if I do not mention El Gashimwan, who is very, very near and dear to Ethiopia. He has served for many years. And I'm happy to see him in this position right now, supporting the review process. I would also like to put, in addition to the financing peace operations, I would like to put a food for thought in our discussion this morning, the fact that which way the world has to go in terms of peace operations. There's a lot of question, of course, 2719 says, alludes to that as well, in terms of franchising the peacekeeping operations. So which way to go? Of course, the United Nations Chapter 8 talks a lot about complementarities, which way is effective, and how much we can apportion. And the African position is that we do also assess contribution. Of course, 2719 is good. We say it's empty, nothing yet. But we believe, due to our assessed contribution, equally like all member countries, the Africa-led peace operations need to be fully funded, 100%. This is, we're somewhere, but we have to push for that. So I think with that note, I would like to wish you a wonderful session and conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those introductory remarks that put forward a couple of issues for us to reflect on as we get into the details of today's event. I also wish to thank you and the mission and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the collaboration and support with Amani Africa as well. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now I would like to turn the mic to David Johannes, who is the senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, who would be leading us through the next event that would be the presentation of the study together with interventions from the panel. David, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much, Solomon, Dr. Solomon. I would like to thank the Amani Africa for inviting the ISIS to take part in this very critical conversation, which is happening at a very timely moment. So may I call the panelists to come to the podium, and I would start by Mr. El Gassimwan. Professor Williams, Ambassador Robert Afriye, Permanent Representative of Ghana to the AU, no? And Ambassador Jens Hanfeld, Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany and Permanent Representative to the AU. Thank you very much. So this panel has the critical task of reimagining the future of peacekeeping. So as a critical starting point is that, why is the question of reimagining the future? So what has called this critical task in the first place? There might be a lot of factors that explain why we are gathered here to discuss about reimagining the future of peace operation. But one critical factor is the fact that we are entering, or we are witnessing, a downward trend of peacekeeping operations. Peacekeeping in the longest history has always been adaptive. It's not always a linear trend that we've been witnessing, but at least in the last couple of years, especially since the last decade, we're witnessing a downward trend, and this has a number of manifestations. For example, the United Nations Security Council has not authorized or mandated any new mission since 2014. And this is not for the absence of critical security situations on the continent or globally, but on the contrary, for the lack of political support for peacekeeping missions. And we're also witnessing that a number of existing peacekeeping operation or peacekeeping missions are under strain to transition to wisdom, and perhaps also for their untimely withdrawal while the conditions on the ground are not conducive. And existing peacekeeping missions are also facing a number of operational challenges. So this is the context that has called for rethinking and imagining in terms of what the future of peacekeeping should look like. So like any exercise about knowing the future, almost no one has a precise and a clear idea about what the future holds for us, and in this case, what the future of peacekeeping looks like. But it's possible to have an informed and foresightful discussion with the kind of speakers that we have, who are going to give us the broader contours of what this future of peacekeeping is going to look like. And this centers around ensuring peacekeeping missions are flexible, nimble, adaptive, context-specific or tailored, and most importantly, they are based on or following a comprehensive approach and driven by or in service of a political strategy. So for this forward-looking discussion, we have a number of panelists and speakers whom I will be introducing. But before, let me just spell out some of the guiding questions that will inform our discussion. And the first one is, we would like to hear the key findings and recommendation from the future of peacekeeping, new models and capabilities. This is a study that was commissioned by the UN, but led by Mr. El Gassimwan, Professor Paul Williams, and Professor Hart as well. So we would like to know the key recommendation and findings from this study. So we're also interested, how can peacekeeping missions can adapt to evolving nature of security challenge, but also in terms of how can it adapt to ongoing geopolitical tensions and political global divides as well. And it's also important to hear also from a member state perspective, how to mandate a new generation of peacekeeping and how to frame these new mandates and who should play in crafting these new missions. And last is how can the African Union and the UN collaborate more effectively to enhance peacekeeping efforts? So we have gathered here a very good list of speakers. I will briefly read their bios and I will give the floor for the first presentation. So we have Mr. El Gassimwan, who is a former special representative of the UN Secretary General and head of MINUSMA, as well as the lead author of the report, The Future of Peacekeeping, New Models and Related Capabilities, which this conference aims to build upon. So Mr. Wan brings decades of experience in conflict prevention, mediation, and peacekeeping. He served as a chief of staff and chief advisor to the African Union Commission chairperson between 2017 and 2019, and as assistant secretary general for peacekeeping operation from 2016 to 2017. The bios are with you, so I'll stop here and move to the next speakers. We also have Professor Paul D. Williams, who's a distinguished scholar and expert in international peace and security, with a particular focus on peace operations and conflict resolution and emerging security threats. He serves as a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, where he also directs the graduate program in security and policy studies. As I mentioned, also he is also the co-author of the study. And we have Ambassador Jens Hansfeld, who is a German ambassador to Ethiopia and permanent observer to the African Union, with a distinguished career in diplomacy. He also served in key roles, including Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C., and a senior official in Germany's Foreign Office. And he's been instrumental in advancing discussion on global peace and security. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Ambassador, to Professor Paul Williams and Mr. El Gassimwan, so that they would give us the gist of their study, focusing on the recommendations and the findings. So you have about, between the two of you, of about 15 minutes. All right, okay.
Thank you so much. And many thanks to Amani and the Executive Director Solomon Derso, good friend and brother of mine, for this opportunity. I'm also happy to see old friends. I see Ambassador Hirut, to work together way back, and to make new friends now, just exchange cards with the number of ambassadors in Addis. As the moderator said, well, I did work here at the AU for 23 years in total, at the Peace and Security Department mostly, before moving to the UN, coming back to the AU, moving to the UN again, and left Mali at the end of 2023, after the Malian authorities requested that the mission pulls out. And last year, colleagues at the UN requested me to lead a study on the future of peacekeeping. I suspect maybe because of our experience in Mali, they felt that maybe I may have one word or two to say about that issue. But I also served as ASK for peacekeeping in New York, overseeing UN peacekeeping missions globally. So it's really, I'm happy to of course, have this conversation in Addis, in a country I'm very much committed to. I've arrived here for the first time in 1990. That's how many years now? 35 years ago, as a student to do a research on a PhD, which I never completed. So don't call me doctor. But anyway, I'm really happy that we have this conversation. And I believe it's extremely important globally, but also important for Africa. I think Solomon did say that Africa is the host of most of UN peacekeeping. So this is a conversation that should really engage African countries, but also the AU as an institution. Especially as the AU came late in the game of peacekeeping. I would say, well, in the 80s, with that failed mission in Chad, but more seriously in the early 90s, starting with Burundi, and then, with other missions, smaller and big ones. But anyway, we'll be talking about them maybe in the course of the day, but I believe the study has a lot of relevance for Africa. And our study, which is titled The Future of Peacekeeping, New Models and Related Capabilities, will inform, I think Solomon said it earlier, the deliberations of the Berlin Ministerial Conference, which is scheduled in May. We already had the opportunity of presenting the study in New York to the C34, I think it was in October 4. We presented it also during an event organized by the Ensure Peace Institute, which brought together several member states, including members of Security Council. It was presented in Montevideo, Uruguay, I think around October or November, I can't remember. And both of us were in Jakarta in January or February, I can't remember now. February, I believe, yes, to also talk about the study. And obviously that process will continue. And as I said, I feel that this discussion today is extremely important for Africa for two reasons. One, the continent is at the forefront of peacekeeping challenges, but it is also at the forefront of peacekeeping or peace support operation innovations. Professor Paul William, together with our colleague from Japan, Professor Ai Kaira Hunt, will present the study. Unfortunately, I think it would have been too much for the finances of Amani to ask them to bring Professor Kaira Hunt, but maybe next time I hope we'll get her here as well, just to make sure that people understand this was a gender inclusive team and not just a team made up of male from America and Africa, but we also had someone from the Asian continent. Now, I will limit myself to a few points because Paul will present the study in details and he does it much better than I do, being a distinguished professor at King's College, at Elliott School. Let me begin by one point which we made in the study, that peacekeeping, United Nations peacekeeping, is a public good that epitomizes multilateralism in action. It brings together key constituencies and benefits from their consensus. The permanent members of the Security Council, the elected members, major financial contributors, including Germany, alongside US, China, France, UK, Russia, South Korea, and so on. Host countries, obviously, relevant regional actors, and more than 2/3 of the UN membership, including Ethiopia, that have provided Rwanda, that have provided over 2 million uniformed peacekeepers to date. And among these contributing countries, close to 40 are African countries. I listed Ethiopia and Rwanda among the lead peacekeeping contributors. And I believe it is fair to state that this contribution by African countries reflects a commitment to multilateralism, which stems not only from principle, but also from a clear-eyed assessment of the continent's interest in today's interconnected world. Multilateral frameworks, of which AU and UN peace operations are vital expressions, remain the most relevant tools for addressing complex security challenges. They enable Africa to engage from a position of collective strength, ensure that its voice is heard in global decision-making, and enable the continent also to build partnerships that are essential for sustainable peace. As we examine the current challenges in peacekeeping, it seems to me crucial to recognize that UN and AU operations, peace operations, are complementary pillars of a shared multilateral architecture. The success of one strengthens the other, while any weakening of either would negatively impact both organizations. Protecting and strengthening peacekeeping is more crucial than ever, particularly given mounting concerns about its future. And one could point here to several developments. As David said, no new UN peacekeeping mission has been authorized since 2014, even though there are numerous situations in which such deployments would have made a huge difference. Existing missions are facing increasing challenges on the ground. Some host countries have called for the withdrawal of peace operations from their territories. MINUSMA is one example, but I could refer to special political missions elsewhere. Geopolitical and other tensions have made it difficult for the Security Council to support its own authorized missions and their mandated political tasks. However, our study reveals a far more nuanced reality that holds important lessons for both the UN and the AU operation. And three key findings are key for our discussions today. First, United Nations peacekeeping has always been an extraordinarily dynamic enterprise. Because often when people speak of UN peacekeeping, the peacekeeping they refer to are the big missions in Congo, in Mali before, in South Sudan, in CAR. And there is one large mission outside Africa, it's UNIFIL in Lebanon, southern Lebanon. But they often forget that those are just one version of UN peacekeeping. UN peacekeeping has been evolving. Since its inception in the late 40s, it has demonstrated remarkable adaptability, with mission varying dramatically in size from few dozens people to dozens of thousands of people, operating in diverse contexts, in places where there is peace to keep, but also in places where there was hardly a peace to keep, operating in one country or operating in a regional geographical settings, and then operating in interstate conflict, but also in intrastate conflict. And peacekeeping missions have performed an ever-expanding list of tasks, ranging from going well beyond armed conflict, including administrating territories, supporting electoral processes, strengthening law enforcement. And this diversity is also reflected in AU operations. We could speak about it at a later stage. And I believe that this adaptability has been one of the United Nations peacekeeping greatest strengths, allowing it to respond to evolving security challenges across different contexts. Second, and I know this may seem counterintuitive, peacekeeping works. In fact, it works for most of the time. Academic studies, and Paul will detail it, have consistently demonstrated that it is a cost-effective way to reducing armed conflict and protecting lives. But there is also another aspect of peacekeeping which I believe is important in an African context, and which often we forget to mention, because when countries request peacekeeping missions to leave, they often invoke sovereignty. But the reality is that peacekeeping strengthens national sovereignty. It has done so in the past because it accompanied decolonization processes, like could list Namibia, for instance, but also because ultimately peacekeeping helps states to recover the exercise of their basic functions. And basically, this is what sovereignty is about, is being controlling your territory and being able to meet the needs of your people. That's the real sovereignty. So, and in the African context, if I was to refer to the real world of impact of peacekeeping, I think I could list many African countries that are much better off today because in their hour of need, they enjoy the support of UN peacekeeping. My brother from Sierra Leone, whom I had the pleasure of meeting, I think your country provides a vivid example of stability achieved, thanks, of course, to the commitment of Sierra Leoneans, but also thanks to the deployment of UN peacekeeping. Obviously, the EU also played an important role. I remember being a young officer at the EU, I accompanied former President Canad Banana of Zimbabwe, because he was in charge of the peace processes in Liberia and Sierra Leone. I went to Sierra Leone a number of times, accompanying him as young officer. Cote d'Ivoire, another example of a country that stabilized thanks to peacekeeping. Liberia, which also achieved a peaceful change I think about a year ago, my memory serves me well, a year ago, or maybe more than a year ago. But I think all these are compelling examples where missions have helped transform conflict zones into more stable societies. And I could list other examples in Latin America, El Salvador, Cambodia, and Asia as examples of successful peacekeeping operations. But even in situations where there is no peace to keep, Darfur in Sudan, Mali, where I was for 3 years, peacekeeping has a positive impact. It has a positive impact, and I can tell you, at least from my own example in Mali, for many civilians, it was the difference between life and death. But obviously, those civilians don't have a voice at the table. We don't hear them. We hear others. And that's why often what peacekeeping missions achieve is overshadowed, because the people who benefit the most from what peacekeepers do are not heard. They are not at the table. They are not in these meetings. They are not at Security Council. They are not at the AU Peace and Security Council. And this observation about the positive impact of peacekeeping applies also to AU missions. AMISOM and its various iterations, AUSOM currently, have made a tangible difference in Somalia. And I remember myself being Director of Peace and Security going to Mogadishu before Mogadishu was fully controlled by the government at that time. It was only half of Mogadishu that was controlled by the Somali government. And the difference was made by AMISOM troops, in particular the Burundians who were in Mogadishu and who fought without equipment and made it possible to achieve it. And we forget about all that. Obviously, Somalia is far from being in a perfect condition. But if Somalia is in the state it is currently, it's thanks to the commitment of African peacekeepers from Ethiopia, from Somalia, from Kenya, from Burundi, and I think few other countries in the process, but also thanks to the support extended by the UN. Point number 3. While peacekeeping works, or rather works most of the time, it is also important, in my view, to understand its nature and limitations. UN peacekeeping is based on certain principles: consent, impartiality, and restricted use of the force, except in defense of the mandate or self-defense, which distinguish peacekeeping from enforcement or combat operations. And this means what? This means that peacekeeping missions cannot be expected, should not be expected to function as a war-fighting tool. Their success primarily depends on the willingness of host nations to cooperate and on the engagement of all the parties in peace processes to cooperate, as well as, of course, on the sustained support of Security Council, regional actors, and the broader international community. They also rely on the support that member states provide in terms of peacekeepers, equipment, and so on. Because often one element that people lose sight of, as a head of a peacekeeping mission, I have troops. But at times, those troops operate on the basis of caveats, which I may not even be aware of, that prevent them from performing certain tasks. And when you need them, you cannot use them because the host country, the contributing country sending them will not allow them to undertake certain tasks. Now, this background informed the peacekeeping models we developed in our study. We developed 30 models. We could have, Paul will explain, we could have gone probably much higher, up to 1,000 models or much lower, but we believe that 30 models reflect basically what UN peacekeeping has done in the past and could do in the future. And these relate to protection of civilians and prevention, traditional monitoring tasks, political transition, functional areas, including DDR, SSR, human security, protection of infrastructure and resources, emerging domain relating to cybersecurity and maritime security, and then special operations that could be regional in nature or limited to a city, for instance. And allow me to make a couple of remarks here on the models. Point number 1, the overwhelming majority of the models we developed can be tied to specific Security Council resolutions, including those relating to maritime security and cybersecurity. So, and this led us to say in the course of our consultation that the future of peacekeeping lies in its past. In actual fact, everything we're proposing has been tried in one way or the other. Point number 2, the models were conceived to help the UN and regional organizations such as the AU address current and emerging challenges. These include traditional armed conflicts and territorial disputes, urban violence, as in Sudan, Khartoum, El Fasher, for instance, maritime threat from the Gulf of Guinea, piracy to Red Sea insecurity, climate conflict nexus, particularly in the Sahel and Lake Chad basin, weaponization of new technologies and cyber threats, transnational organized crime, and risk of conflict relapse in post-conflict countries. Third, the models are simplified representations of complex problems. Of course, they could not describe everything in details. We did not assess their political feasibility. That has to be done against the specific situations in which the PSC or the UN Security Council intend to deploy them. But it's easy for us, when I look at the map of Africa, to really identify places where particular types of missions could be deployed based on the models we have designed. Four, the models provide the Security Council with as many options as possible from which it can draw to respond to a particular threat to peace and security. And this means that the Security Council is not bogged down into deploying a large mission or not deploying. In between, there are a range of options the Security Council could make recourse to. But the diversity of models is also meant to give a better sense to potential host countries of the range of support that the UN could provide to assist them in restoring peace and security. And fifth, the models create opportunities for the AU in two ways. Being smaller and more focused, some are more affordable than traditional large-scale missions. And some of the models require robust force deployment, and the EU can leverage its demonstrated capacity to operate in non-permissive environment, as shown in Somalia and Mali to some extent. It's a slightly different case. And the UN has unique advantages in implementing these models. Extensive field experience and operational expertise, Paul will speak about it, universal membership of the UN, authority of Security Council in spite of all the challenges to mandate any necessary task, predictable financing system, absolutely key. We can see the difference with the AU, and I can tell you when I was at the AU, we deploy a mission, the PSC authorized the deployment of the mission, and then the next task for us is not really to deploy the mission, is to go and beg for money. At the UN, it's completely different. If mission is authorized, the resources are there, and you can do it. And then a robust accountability mechanisms that are really unmatched in multilateral institutions. But that said, to maximize the chances of success of peacekeeping, the UN must work with other entities and build strong partnership with them within the UN, but also outside the UN, in particular the AU. And here, looking at the AU, we have proposed a range of implementation modalities for the models we identify. You could think of sequential deployment, AU first, UN later. Parallel deployments has happened. In Ethiopia, Eritrea, we had the UN and me, and then we had Olbi, a small AU mission that was way back. Looks like, very old cases that people don't even remember. We could think of situations in which the UN mandates a regional organization to undertake a particular task, including providing the necessary resources, as is currently the case in Somalia. Now, while peacekeeping is effective, it's not a panacea. Its success depends on enhanced capabilities and sustained support. Our study has highlighted several critical areas that require increased investment, planning, leadership, data management, strategic communication, rapid deployment capabilities, and security and welfare of peacekeepers. And I believe that as the AU reviews its own African standby force, the priorities we identified could provide a basis for the AU to draw a roadmap to inform its modernization efforts. Our study also emphasizes that the success of any peacekeeping mission ultimately, and I think we should never lose sight of it, rests on the commitment of host countries and conflict parties. No outsiders can make peace and substitute the will and commitment of the local parties. Peacekeeping works when the government cooperates and the parties are committed to peace. And then success also demands coordinated support from multiple stakeholders. The Security Council obviously has a key role to support the missions it's mandating, but at the same time, regional actors, African organizations, especially the AU and its regional mechanism, have a key role to play. and that includes leveraging their influence with host countries and conflict parties to advance political processes and improve operational conditions on the ground. It also means clear and principled stance from the AU Peace and Security Council, as well as proactive and adequately informed engagement in the context of Security Council through the African members of that body, the A3. The A3 have a particularly strategic role to play when they raise operational and political challenges facing missions. Guided by AU principles, their voice carries unique weight and can help transcend the geopolitical division that sometimes emerge on peacekeeping issues. And I believe that this active African leadership is crucial as the continent stands to be the primary beneficiary of successful UN peacekeeping operations on the continent. And again, here, just to give an example based on my own experience. While I was in Mali, obviously you face a number of challenges on human rights investigation, freedom of movement, and so on. But these issues were raised at Security Council mostly by the P3, means France, UK, and the US, but hardly by the African stakeholders. Yet most of the peacekeepers were Africans. Now, when the issue is raised by the P3, what it triggers is, we go back to the geopolitics. Then the P2 may be more reluctant, looking at it as literally political instrumentalization. It would make a big difference if those issues were brought up by African stakeholders, because then you can take those issues out of the geopolitical equation and get them raised on their own merit. And that's why I believe the A3 and the EU have a key role to play. Let me conclude by reiterating that while peacekeeping must continuously evolve to meet emerging challenges, its fundamental value proposition remains sound. It represents a global commitment to collective security and shared responsibility. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My thanks as well to Germany and all the other partners in the ministerial peacekeeping process that supported the writing of the study, and to Amani, the team, for inviting me here today. The study is about 50 pages long, and I don't know, how long would you like me to summarize it in? 10 minutes? Okay, 15. Okay. You asked for it, sort of thing. So no, if we, and I don't know who's controlling the slides, but if we can go to the next one. So as you've already heard, a lot of the key points from Mr. Wan, our study was asked and basically commissioned to do three things. We were supposed, number one, to look back at the history of United Nations peace operations and assess and evaluate what had been done and how well it had been done. And the universe of operations, and it's hard to see on this map here, but that is roughly 120 UN missions deployed in over 50 countries around the world. And if you add up all the mandated tasks for those 120 plus missions, you very quickly get over 1,000 different mandated tasks for UN missions. This 120 figure is peacekeeping operations plus what the UN calls special political missions or peacebuilding operations. For the purposes of our study, that was an arbitrary distinction. If you don't know, the UN created the category of special political missions in 1990, and it's a financial distinction that is used dependent on which source and type of funding is used. It's not a distinction that works in terms of the mandates and the tasks and activities that the missions do. So our study looked at that whole universe of 120 or so missions in 50 plus countries. The second thing we were asked to do was then to come up, looking to the future rather than looking backwards, to come up with models and a modular way of thinking about the tasks that UN peace operations could perform going forward. And as Mr. Wan has said, we landed on the 30 models. In fact, maybe if you just fast forward to the slide, it's about 5 or 6 on, with the 30 models up there. We can leave that there for people to look at. And I don't know if people have actually looked at the study yet or not, but I'll assume you haven't. Keep going, one more. one more, that's it. It's impossible to read, so I don't know if I'm useful. But there are 30 models, and we think these capture the major plausible strategic objectives that peace operations could be able to achieve in the field. And then the third thing we were asked to do, and this is more now in mind with the ministerial sort of pledging process in the lead up to the Peacekeeping Summit, was to think, okay, if these are the models that sort of give us the menu of options for future peace operations, what are the capabilities that the UN is going to need to be able to implement these in the field? And that meant assessing the current state of UN capabilities in terms of its structures in New York, but also its links with the field missions, and of course, all the troop and police and civilian contributing countries as well. So that in a nutshell is what the study does. It answers those three types of questions about the past of UN peace operations, providing a modular way of thinking about future missions and how to assemble them. And thirdly, providing our sort of assessment of where we need better and improved capabilities, specifically that might be turned into pledges in a peacekeeping ministerial summit that we'll have in Berlin in May. In terms of just if I was to summarize the sort of main conclusions that come out of it, you've heard some of them from Mr. Wan already. The first big conclusion was we're trying to push a narrative shift here, really, about the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping. We think that over the last decade in particular, there's been a sort of unfair, I would argue, negativity and sort of almost fatalism about the prospects of UN peacekeeping. And as the study goes in great detail, actually, there's over 38 independent studies and reports published in the top journals in the field that provide overwhelming positive supportive evidence that UN peacekeeping not only works most of the time, but even in the places where it's considered a broad failure, it actually has a lot of positive impacts at local levels, whether it's for civilians or other types of issues. And so point one of the study was to sort of remind people of that. Yeah, peacekeeping has done a lot and it's done most of it very well. There are challenges, as we'll get to later, but overall, we should talk about the effectiveness of peacekeeping, not its failures. And the other way to think of this is if you compare it to other foreign policy tools in the toolbox, things like peace enforcement and military intervention, or economic sanctions and coercive diplomacy, peacekeeping has a far better track record than any of those other foreign policy instruments. Our conclusion is that there is simply no better way to end other people's wars than to provide third-party support through peace operations. And no one has come up with a better idea of how to do that. The second big sort of conclusion we landed on was that the UN actually is well positioned to take on the future of these different peace operations because it has a number of comparative advantages available to it. And I won't go into details about all of these, but suffice to say, even though it's facing trouble at the moment, the UN retains the key sort of global convening power. It's able to bring more people and more countries together than any other organization. It still has the key authorizing power. It can authorize and crucially support and deploy literally any type of peace operation that the Security Council can envisage and mandate. And in that sense, it has an unparalleled flexibility. A third comparative advantage that we conclude is that if you want multidimensionality, right, if you want missions that are not just soldiers, but include police and other civilians, this is where the UN's force generation capabilities and other mission support structures give it a real comparative advantage. It's really only the United Nations that can deploy multiple thousands of police and civilians and sustain them in the field. Fourth, as Mr. Wan has already mentioned, the money. The UN system of financing its peace operations, believe us, we all know it's complicated, it's difficult, it has all sorts of issues, but fundamentally it works. And if needs be, it can work for decades in a row. Some of the missions in Kashmir, for example, and elsewhere, they've been going for 7 decades plus, and money is not the problem. So financially, the UN has an important comparative advantage. Fifth, it's a learning organization. And this is something we really try to flag because we don't think the UN gets enough credit here. as one already mentioned, yeah, over 120 missions, over 1,000 mandated tasks. We have made this up as we've gone along. Peace operations are literally diplomatic constructivism. Yeah, there's nowhere in the UN Charter that this stuff is written down. The whole enterprise of peace operation has been a learning endeavor. And we would argue that the UN now is pretty well situated with a lot of structures that can help it develop its organizational learning. And again, we would argue, comparatively speaking, it's second to none in the multilateral world. And finally, and this is also important, the UN comes with integrated accountability structures built into its missions, particularly the decade and a bit now that we've had HRDDP, the human rights due diligence policies. If you deploy UN missions, they come with various compliance and accountability structures built in, and that's not always the case for other regional organizations and options. So that's the sort of other second big conclusion. The third big conclusion was that we think the modular approach to thinking about the future of peace operations has some added value. And I'll list at least the sort of the highlights here. First, though, I need to define what we mean by models, because as we're a multilingual study team putting this together, and it's just an interesting aside, the words model, module, and modular, whether you're speaking in English, French, Italian, Spanish, Arabic, Japanese, Korean, etc., there is a lot of different ways that people understand these terms, right? And don't get me started on the German, which you know much better than me. But the way we define models for the purposes of the study is as a package of three things, right? Each model for us contains, firstly, a strategic goal. There's a strategic objective you're trying to achieve, and that is the 30 of them that you see on the slide here. And that strategic objective could range from real broad issues like trying to enhance maritime security, to protecting civilians, to ceasefire monitoring, but there's a strategic goal. Secondly, there's a bundle of potential mandated mission tasks that could achieve that strategic goal. So, for example, if maritime security is the strategic objective as our model number 30, the mission mandates might be very different. You might have counter-piracy types of missions. You might have navigation protection operations. You might have search and rescue. You might have the type of things we've seen with UNIFIL's Maritime Task Force to help provide aid and assistance. You could have mine sweeping and mine clearance operations at sea. So there's a whole different bundle of mission mandates that could go under each model. And then the third thing is that all of them require certain capabilities to implement. So in each of the models, we give a short list of the types of uniformed and civilian capabilities that you would need to implement these in the field. And that is where obviously the pledging process for the Peacekeeping Ministerial Summit will start to focus more closely. And when we were in Uruguay and Indonesia, and I've also been in Berlin and Canada and a few other places as well, where the conversation has really gone in a more operational sense is, where do these capabilities, where are they lacking at the moment in the UN system, and hence where might pledging play an important role going forward? So if that's what we mean by models, why do we think it's useful? One already touched on the key points, but just to reiterate them. Number one is we think, look, at a time when the Security Council is increasingly divided, and also at a time where some host governments are increasingly skeptical about UN peace operations, a modular way of thinking about these things can hopefully bring people together, even if it's only around cooperation on lowest common denominators that we can agree on. But as one said, right, the 30 models here give both the Security Council and host governments a much bigger range of choices than just our traditional thinking about either a big $1 billion a year multidimensional mission or a tiny chapter 6, traditional ceasefire monitoring. It's not a binary choice. There are literally 30 different strategic objectives that we can talk about with the Security Council and the host governments. And we think if you think of it and debate of it in these terms, this might help generate greater cooperation at the Security Council, but it will also hopefully clarify to host governments what are the things that the UN can plausibly deliver with peace operations, and what are the things that are beyond the realm of the possible. And so we hope this can better inform host governments without whom, of course, if we don't have ultimately a trusting relationship and a cooperative relationship with host governments, the future of peace operations is going to be very short. So a modular way of thinking can help. The third thing is we were pushing back a little bit here on the so-called Christmas tree mandate approach, where, you know, all the missions in the last sort of 20 years or so have come with about 4,000 word mandates, and they've tended to have their mandates front loaded all at once. A modular approach might be a way, we argue, to help think about how you sort of focus and then ramp up missions, and also sort of ramp down missions in a transition process when somebody else might take over. And so missions could be conceived quite narrowly, where you pick a combination of models ultimately, but you might start off with just one or two that are focused on the precise needs and tailored to the needs on the ground at the time. So you mentioned El Fasher as one example, you know, in Darfur. You know, maybe around a city like that, you know, undergoing all the problems, maybe the key element is an element of sort of DDR, right? A degree of disarmament and demobilization, maybe demilitarizing certain areas around a ceasefire or cessation of hostilities agreement. But that might be your entry point and a way in. If you think about the huge challenges of Gaza, for example, and all the debates we've been having over the last few months about the different types of peace operations that might be deployed in Gaza, and we've heard everything from a ceasefire monitoring mission right through to a transitional administration, we would argue that actually mine clearance and explosive ordnance removal is the sine qua non, right? It's the fundamental requirement before anybody does anything else in that territory. You're going to have to clear the mines, the unexploded ordnance, and make it safe for people to operate in a peace-building sense. This is what the modular sort of approach gives you, I think, is a way of thinking about narrow, tailored entry points without bringing the entire Christmas tree mandate along with it. And of course, you can ramp up and add other models to build a broader mission as you go, but you needn't start with them all at the beginning. And we think that is more likely to find a cooperative sort of place at the Security Council. And it's also more likely to find a cooperative ear with host governments, because as Mr. Wan said, ultimately, most of the time, peace operations are sovereignty enhancing, not sovereignty degrading. And we need to remind host governments of that. Actually, the last one, I should just say, Burundi was actually the last mission that was authorized by the UN in 2016, but was never deployed, remember? It was a policing operation, but it was never deployed because the Burundian government didn't give its consent for that mission to deploy. And then final conclusion, because of all these things, we think peace operations are a good investment. They continue to be a good and cost-effective investment. And as Mr. Wan said here, you know, our remit in the study was global, of course. We were supposed to look at the whole world here, but for Africa specifically, these things really are complementary, right? A strong UN system can complement a strong African Union system, an APSA, and the world is better off with both of them. There is a useful and constructive division of labor that we can have here between the United Nations and what it can bring, and what African-led missions can bring can be complementary. And so our sort of fourth big conclusion, and we provide the evidence to support it in the study, is that the structures we've got at the moment in New York, UNOAU in Addis and other places, right, are worth keeping because they're an investment that is both cost effective and politically effective. And that leads us finally to the third bit of the study, which was about the capabilities that are necessary to achieve these things. And there's a lot, but we sort of highlight a few, and I'll just mention a couple that are key here now. One is about planning. And this, I would argue, applies to the African Union and the RECs as much as it does to the UN. A big thing we heard from all our interviews, and we did hundreds of interviews and sort of focus groups for this, but a big thing we heard was that these models won't make it to the real world if there's not planners that are thinking about them day in, day out, and thinking about how to build missions around particular scenarios in Gaza, in Darfur, in Lebanon, in, well, let's say Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, wherever it is, and wherever the next ones are going to be. Planning capabilities are absolutely crucial. And so one of the key recommendations we flag is the need for integrated planning, not just the military folks doing this on their own, but military, civilians, and police. A second key area was leadership, both at New York and in the field. There's a bunch of ways in which we would argue that the UN system can improve the ways it hires and thinks about, crucially, the skill sets that are needed for its leaders at New York and in the field. And then the third one that I'll just highlight here is we're in just a new world when it comes to data and information management about peace operations. And so one of our other major sort of recommendations is that we've got to try and bring the UN into the 21st century when it comes to data and information management. And that involves obviously cybersecurity in terms of protecting the integrity of its own systems and information and data. But crucially, give it the capabilities to actually interpret the data that it is hoovering up. And the good news is that UN missions are hoovering up a ton more data than they used to even a decade and a half ago. They have a bunch of systems that are much more capable than they have a decade and a half ago. But what they lack are the people, and I'm not being derogatory here, but basically nerds, geeks, computer experts, data analytics people, probably that are going to be younger than all of us in the room at the moment, right? It's the younger generation that are best with this stuff, but we need to get people hired at the UN who have the skills to navigate the data universe that we're in at the moment, and we don't. It's only with these types of folks that we're going to be getting the best out of the data that we're hoovering up by interpreting the patterns and then making the arguments and conclusions that are right. And that leads to the last one that's connected is that's going to need a better strategic communications. Again, a way of putting together Stratcom's teams and thinking about how can the UN be the narrator in the key conflict environments that it faces. Previously, it's not been the narrator. It's been playing catch up to other people's narratives. It's been fighting, I would argue, with sort of one arm tied behind its back. It's always on the back foot. It's reactive. It needs to get ahead of the game, and it needs to be the narrator of choice in the conflict settings that it's being deployed. And that will only come with a different and better approach to strategic communications. Final thing, because we're in Addis, is to play up the modalities point that Juan mentioned. In the study, we were asked, of course, to write this about UN-led missions. And there is a, UN-led missions could do any of these 30 models tasks. But in reality, and most often, partnerships will be the name of the game. And peace operations partnerships will be crucial. So for all of the models, we also developed and summarized a range of different modalities, as one already mentioned, whereby the UN can partner with either regional organizations, coalitions of the willing, and we outline a few of the different types of model structures, from hybrid to parallel to sequential to joint operations, and we define what we mean by those in the study. But that is in recognition that, certainly obviously for the missions that we'll deploy in Africa, it is almost certain that there's going to be partnerships of one type or another. So again, we need to think through what partnerships look like in an operational sense, which gets us back to the ambassador's gone now, but the financing question 2719 and how we're going to work through those issues there. So I'm sorry that was a bit longer, but that's I hope a reasonable summary of what's in our study.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams, but also Mr. El-Gassimwan. Ambassador Hanfield, you may respond to some of the issues that was presented by the two co-authors, but you can also address some of the questions, including the mandating process and issues related to the AU-UN partnership. Sir, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. A word of caution, I will not go into the details of the discussion of this study, and particularly, I think, spare you a debate on models and the definition of them. But I would like to begin, first of all, by thanking Amani Africa for organizing this timely event. The Solomon, I'm grateful to you and your team in organizing this forum that allows us to understand and discuss African perspectives in the run-up and the preparations of the next UN peacekeeping ministerial, which Germany is proud to host on May 13 and 14 in Berlin. We believe this meeting is of crucial importance, particularly also with regard to African countries, but not only them. We are currently in a stage where the whole system of international order is being challenged and questioned in many ways. So we think this is a very timely opportunity to sit down to discuss these very important issues. African states, as well as the AU and African regional organizations, have been key actors in peacekeeping. As has been mentioned, not only are 4 of the 5 largest UN peacekeeping missions based in Africa, but African states are also among the largest troop and police contributing countries in the world. Around 25,000 men and women from the African continent currently serve in peacekeeping missions, contributing to peace and security on their continent, but also in other parts of the world. And we should keep that in mind as well. Even more are serving in African-led peace operations, and particularly here in Addis. I think it is also important to highlight the role which our host country has been playing in this since the creation of the United Nations. Ethiopia has indeed played a very important role also as a contributing country when it comes to UN missions. Tragically, some African peacekeepers make the ultimate sacrifice, the pursuit of international peace and security. And please allow me to express my sincere condolences to Tunisia, South Africa, and Malawi, who are mourning the recent deaths of their peacekeepers in various missions. African states, the AU, and Africa RECs are also on the forefront of finding political solutions in support of UN peacekeeping. The very successful last UN peacekeeping ministerial in Ghana is a testament to the leading role African states play in ensuring that UN peace operations live up to the challenges of today. Germany is convinced that UN peacekeeping remains one of the most relevant, legitimate, and cost-effective tools for preventing, managing, and resolving armed conflict. We therefore support UN peacekeeping as the largest donor of extra budgetary funding to the UN Departments of Peace, Operations, and Operational Support, also through providing German soldiers and police, as well as through training and capacity building efforts to various member states. We hope to welcome many African foreign and defense ministers to Berlin for the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial. As many of you will know, Germany is currently going through the period of forming a new government, but allow me to assure all of you that regardless of the fact that we will probably have a different set of ministers in place by the time of the meeting, Germany, regardless, remains absolutely committed and looks forward to this meeting. This is something which I would just like to highlight on this occasion. The ministerial will be and serve as a high-level forum to discuss the future of peacekeeping. And I think the study which has been presented here, I think will provide an important impact to create the basis for an informed debate. As I said, we are convinced that UN peacekeeping remains one of the most relevant, legitimate, and cost-effective tools for preventing, managing, and resolving armed conflict. But UN peace operations need to adapt to emerging threats and new realities. The Berlin Ministerial would be an opportunity to discuss partnerships between the UN and regional organizations, such as the AU, in international crisis management. Germany remains supportive of the landmark UN Security Council Resolution 2719. We all know the challenges the implementation of this resolution is currently facing, but we do hope to give new impetus to discussions on its operationalization in Berlin. I think, as I mentioned, the study presented here today is an important guideline and mapping exercise to look ahead at what we need to discuss And I would like to use the opportunity to say thank you to both of you and to everyone involved in putting it together. As the limits of current peacekeeping frameworks have increasingly been tested, potential new models of peace operations need to be explored. And I think the study aptly demonstrates the ongoing relevance of UN peacekeeping and the opportunities it offers to current and potential future host states. Ladies and gentlemen, this year we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Back in 1945, the United Nations were the right answer at the right time. Today, Germany believes the UN still is the right answer. However, it needs to adapt to the world of today and of tomorrow. Germany is convinced that the African continent will not only bring African solutions to African problems, but to global challenges as well. We therefore hope that many African foreign and defense ministers will travel to the UN Peacekeeping Ministerial in May to engage in these necessary discussions. I look forward to today's discussions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. So we've heard a lot about the content and the findings and the recommendation of the study, but we also heard a lot about the specific context that this study was done and what it aims to achieve in terms of inspiring the debate around the future of peacekeeping operations. So let me I'll just flag out a couple of points that were presented as part of the presentation. The first one is in terms of why peacekeeping matters. So the presentation has given us some food for thought in terms of that peacekeeping epitomizes multilateralism in action. So this helps us to pose a counterfactual question. If UN peacekeeping is not working now, then what would be the alternative? So I think it's important to go back to this basic question of thinking about the very rationale of what peacekeeping operation does. And also, the presentation was also important in terms of giving us the diverse dimension of the debate, literally taking our focus away from what is not working to what is possible as well. And this is very critical to historicize the discourse and the debate, so that we will not focus so much in terms of what's not working in peacekeeping or in broader peace and security issues. The crux of the presentation is around the models. So I heard this presentation for a second time. It's not the kind of presentation that you would get the gist of it in the first instance. So, but I think I get a lot out of it in terms of what the models entail. So it's easy to criticize saying that there is nothing new in the new studies. But I strongly argue that's not the case. So we heard a lot in terms of what the models entail and why these models are relevant in the current geopolitical context. So it infuses some sort of a fresh perspective to the debate when a lot of fresh perspective is needed. So let me stop here. We heard a lot from this side of the table. So I'll give the floor to the audience to raise questions and comments. Yeah. EU first, yeah.
Dear High Panel, Excellencies, dear guests in the room, many thanks at least for this presentation. It leads me to two questions, and let me allow to give a comment. So I'm Andre from the EU delegation to the African Union, the Senior Advisor for Peace and Security here. You were talking about capacities, and looked into the landscape right now, we do have at the moment, and using the example of Somalia, where we do have UN source roughly 500 million for costs and at least roughly a little bit above 200 million for at least the mission itself on this side. Where do we see us in 10 years in the balance of capabilities that are provided from the continent? And that leads me to the question, how do we coordinate at least the capacity building? And I'm really like these modules you were presenting today, then they show us the complexity and at least the quality that is needed and the process behind. Right now we do have capacity building on the continent more in the bilateral way. So how is then the continental approach for capacity building, and that is needed to answer at least this complex process, be built. We do have, and that was said here, the African Standby Force review, May and June presented. So we do have the time right now, and that makes at least this conference timely. How do we influence at least the system? How are we setting at least these line to go to a continental coordinated approach for capacity building? So showing us at least the trends, showing us the demands of the regions, discuss with the regions to spend our efforts in a more effective way as partners. The second question is at least related to the UN and African Union process of peacekeeping. It was mentioned planning, personal training. So right now we do have different systems here. We can send UN planners to the system, but what are they planning at least to the African system? Are they in line? Do we have one curriculum in training, and how to work on that? I think these questions will lead us also to the next panels for the day, but so far from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panelists for this presentation. My question is, I've been in the UN, also involved in this kind of operations before. But the principal basis for peacekeeping emanates from the fact that there are legitimate governments that should be protected by the decisions of Security Council and other institutions, even the African Union. But what we see in Somalia and the DRC so far is UN and AU peacekeeping operations trying to maintain illegitimate governments that have no support from their own population? Or is it a continuation of something that has to be done continuously? Despite the fact that we had 2 decades of peacekeeping in Somalia and the DRC, what we see today in the incursions by M23 and supported by some African countries, and also the fate of Al-Shabaab, is there any opportunity to bring Al-Shabaab to the table to have some discussions on what the future of Somalia could be instead of renewing peacekeeping operations that are going to be endless and that are draining the efforts of the United Nations and the donor countries that contribute funds to these operations? Now, with the new American administration that we have in place, which is very skeptical of the peacekeeping operations by the UN, what's going to be the fate of this? I know you've mentioned some of these issues in your presentations, but definitely these are trying times for the UN peacekeeping operations that goes into a couple of billions of dollars every year. So taking DRC and Somalia as an example, I think what we need to do is come up with some kind of an intelligent discussion here to guide the African Union and the UN, if possible, to come up with solutions that are more grassrooted rather than trying to bring in military operations and peacekeeping operations every time the situation escalates beyond control. Thank you.
Okay, let's give the opportunity. Okay.
Thank you, moderator, and also thank you all speakers. I have two questions that I need more information. And my question is direct to Professor Paul Williams. The first one is in the models, the set models, when I go through the list, most of them can be happen at once. And as you said, the models inform the strategic objectives. So if that's the case, is the models can be used by the UN Security Council at once, like for example, many multi-models at once, like for example, maybe 10 models at once. So how is the reviews? If they are strategic objectives, so meaning will the mission have multi-strategic objectives that needs multi-modules at once? That is my question. The second one is, you said the peacekeeping operations is cost-effective and politically also effective. Compared to preventive diplomacy, prevention mission, how do you compare to when you say cost-effective? It requires billions of dollars for a peacekeeping. Like one mission could have, for example, to my information, once like 8 billion, something like that. So how do you define cost-effective when you say it is a cost-effective? Thank you.
Thank you. Now back to the presenters to address this set of questions. Let me start from
Yeah, okay, thank you. What order to go in? I think actually, if I start with the last questions first and just clarify some of the points and then work back. On the 30 models, yeah, so they could be deployed. You can envisage a mission that just deployed according to one model. It could be a preventative deployment like we had in Macedonia in 1992, yeah, and the whole mission is built around one model. But you could also stack them together and have missions that are made up of multiple models that go together. And in fact, most of our existing multidimensional missions, you're right to point out, they probably include about a dozen of these models are already built into a mission like MONUSCO, right, or MINUSMA. So the issue, or what we think can help here, is the difference between encouraging strategic clarity and strategic confusion. Right, the models, as we've listed them, are defined around 30 different strategic objectives you're trying to achieve, right? Effects you're trying to create on the ground. And thinking of it in those ways, I think, can help bring a bit of strategic clarity to what a mission might be trying to do. The problem we've seen in the traditional way of mandating missions, which have lots of these elements in there, is that Security Council resolutions don't prioritize clearly between the different objectives in the mandate, and that leads to strategic confusion. It also, we would argue, has a problem in sequencing terms, that just because something is worth doing in a mission doesn't mean it's all worth doing at the same time. And certain things might be better emphasized at the beginning of a mission, and other things might be better emphasized in the middle, and other things might be better emphasized in the transition towards exit. So yeah, that's how we can combine them. With cost effective, yeah, you can define that in slightly different ways, and we do in the study in a bit more detail. So the first way to think about cost effective is to basically do scenarios and to plot hypothetical futures and how much they would cost. And so this is all about cost estimating future scenarios. And we refer to a number of key academic studies that have done this and come to the conclusion that countries with UN peacekeeping missions generally save a lot of money in terms of other peripheral costs to the scenario where they weren't deployed. So there's sort of scenario-based ways of doing cost effectiveness. The second is just to compare it to the costs of escalating war. So the second way we mean they're cost effective is that if you don't deploy a peace operation, really what's most likely to happen is a war is likely to continue to escalate. Look at Haiti, look at Gaza, look at Darfur, look at Myanmar, take your pick of current wars. We would argue that in almost all cases, the countries that have got UN peacekeeping missions are better not ideal, but better than the ones without. As I said, look at the war zones like Yemen or Myanmar or Ukraine at the moment, Gaza, with no peace operations. We would argue it's cost effective compared to an escalating and ongoing war. And then final way it's cost effectiveness, or to think about cost effectiveness, is how the UN can deploy more cost effectively than other potential mechanisms. And here, in particular, if you think about unilateral Western deployments, how much it would cost America, France, UK, etc., to deploy equivalent numbers of soldiers, it's much cheaper than that. And so those are the three ways that we think about cost effectiveness in the report. Then just briefly on the other questions. So, I mean, the gentleman here, these are good political challenges. I mean, I think something I didn't say, but we mentioned in the study, peacekeeping is only part of the engagement, right? The real key here is peacemaking. Peacemaking is the key that can unlock real peace and sustainable peace in these war zones. And so in the study, we argue that you could have very effective peace operations that do all their mandated things, at an operational and tactical level effectively. But unless you can end the war, this is not the key point, right? And so this leads to the Somalia example as well. AUSOM as it is now, AUSOM, can't achieve peace unless we ultimately, I think, have to negotiate a settlement with al-Shabaab between them and the federal government. So peace operations can limit the damage. Peace operations can do a lot of useful things at the operational and tactical level, but they can't deliver sustainable peace unless they're in parallel with a peacemaking process that works. But that's too much and unfair to load all that on the peacekeepers. That's the job of the mediators, the diplomats, etc., the peacemakers. And then, the US. So I've just come from Washington, D.C. I may not sound like it, but I am an American as well as a Brit. I've lived in the US for 20 odd years now. We're in unprecedented tough times at the moment. My version of what this current Trump-Musk administration is doing is effectively disassembling American multilateral engagement as we've known it for the last few decades. And they're starting by cutting the civil servants and the federal workforce that supports that multilateralism, both at home and abroad. And I mean, my city has lived through the last couple of months. Tens of thousands of jobs have been cut from the US federal workforce. Many of those are precisely the frontline people doing US aid, foreign policy, peacekeeping, and multilateral support. So this is a very trying time to be thinking about it. So number one, I think the rest of the world, if it wants to support peacekeeping, needs to prepare for a world of US disengagement on these issues. And I would argue not just passive disengagement. The current administration wants these multilateral institutions to disappear. And that will be reflected in the second point in your answer to your question. Budgetarily and financially, I would encourage all supporters of peacekeeping to prepare for a situation where the United States contributes $0 to the UN regular budget and the UN peacekeeping assessed contributions for the next 4 years while this administration is in office. You may remember Trump 1.0 in the initial authorized White House budget, or the planned White House budget, also zeroed out those things. But he didn't control Congress at the time, and the Republicans in Congress basically funded multilateral endeavors at the reasonable rate. This time there's a different Congress in power, and it's much more aligned with thinking. So my second response would be, financially, we need to prepare for a scenario where the United States doesn't contribute either to the UN regular budget or the roughly 1.8 billion or so that its contributions come to in the peacekeeping assessments. And you'll know better than me, we're already 1.3 billion in arrears roughly from the last time where they didn't pay their dues anyway. And then that leads finally to the AU-UN cooperation point and capabilities. And just briefly on that, I mean, what we highlight in the study, we were asked to look forwards, right, more than backwards on capabilities here. So there's a tech story and a tech-heavy contributions and capabilities story and a sort of human element heavy story. So I think there's a lot of the models there that are going to need quite technologically sophisticated and quite innovative capabilities, which really are going to be residing in just the richer parts of the world, right? But these missions can't be solely tech missions. There needs to be the human element. And so when it comes to soldiers, police, and other civilians, Africa is going to be right there at the forefront, I think. And we need to think again about how African and other UN contributing countries can train their personnel in ways that we need to implement these types of mandates. So yeah, I'll stop there. And oh no, actually, last thing. On a practical sense, I mean, I would say we don't need to reinvent the wheel at one level. When I look at the UN force generation system, and in particular the PCRS, basically the peacekeeper capabilities and readiness system, I think the best thing that African states could do initially is to make sure their contributions are plotted and geared into the PCRS system, and particularly work hard to get the units that are necessary up to the rapid deployment level in PCRS. That's the best guarantee of when they deploy that they will have the financing and funding systems and other support mechanisms to deliver on mandates in the field. So that, I think, would be my sort of initial recommendation. Work towards getting contributions logged and registered in the PCRS system, and particularly some at the rapid deployment level.
Thank you, Paul. I think you have covered most of the issues. Maybe just let me start where you ended on the PCRS, and there is a box in the report that explains how it works in the UN system, and it works. You have units that are pledged, that are assessed, and that are ready to be deployed based on different timelines. So when you are on the rapid deployment level, obviously, I think it's 60 days, some even shorter. And then countries are paid to maintain those units so that, but of course, the quiproquo is that they have to commit to deploy them anywhere, depending on UN requests. And I think it works very well. It replaced an earlier system. What was the name of that system again? Standby arrangement, indeed, which did not work as much. And this one works perfectly. And linking it to the issue of capacity building as raised by the EU colleague. As you know, the EU launched the ASF in 2004 when we had that framework. But the African Standby Force has not really been operationalized up to now. And all the EU deployments, and I stand to be corrected, but I think there were only maybe one mission deployed after I left the EU, at least from my recollection in 2015. Have been deployed outside the formal framework of the ASF, correct? Outside. So the ASF hasn't been operational. And yet countries do pledge units, regions do pledge units, but we don't know. In reality, at least from my time as director, we had no idea on whether the units pledged by the countries were really properly equipped. And in many cases, when we deployed missions, be it in Mali or even smaller missions, you realize that countries come in, they have the willingness to be in, but they don't have the capabilities. So I believe maybe one thing the EU could look at, potentially in the context of its partnership with the UN, would be how could the EU leverage the PCRS? Means what? When African countries pledge units in the context of the UN, and these units are assessed, they could also be used by the EU, was it to deploy a peacekeeping mission. And that would save a lot of time because the assessment is already done by the UN, and the UN has the resources, has the expertise to do the assessment. And one could think of joint assessments for African units, for instance. Of course, the UN works globally. So I believe there are a number of ways through which peace capacity building could be streamlined and made much more effective. I did also say in my opening remarks that in our report, we have listed a number of capabilities that are needed to make UN peacekeeping more effective. And those capabilities apply to the EU as well. Strategic communication, information integrity, even though not much has happened in this field at the level of the EU, safety and welfare of peacekeepers. So I could rapid deployment capabilities. We did also raise it. So that can provide a good roadmap for the AU as it reviews its own ASF. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, because on all those issues, extensive work has been done by the UN. Obviously, it may not apply completely to the African context, but I believe it can serve as a basis for the AU to take forward the African Standby Force. The other point I wanted to raise, I think, Paul, you spoke about it, but just to make a point, an additional point on it, I think it was Coste who referred the issue of negotiations with armed groups, be it Al-Shabaab or M23 in the Congo. I completely agree. At the end of the day, what you need is a political solution, and the political solution can only be achieved through dialogue. There is no alternative to dialogue. Be it in Congo or in Somalia or elsewhere, you need dialogue. And it would be unfair to request peacekeepers because they can only, I'm saying there are limits as to what they can do. Their role is to facilitate a political agreement, to create space for parties to speak. But if parties fail to speak for whatever reason, obviously, the risk is that peacekeepers will stay there for ages and for decades. It does not mean they are useless, because even when there is no political dialogue, they make an impact for local populations. And that has been largely demonstrated in a number of occasions. Last point on the models, Paul, you referred to them. Obviously, the models can be used. We can use one model for a mission. We can use 2 or 3 or combine many more models. There is another aspect which has not been highlighted, and I believe you need to keep it in mind. Paul referred to models as entry points. You can start with, let's say, urban security in El Fasher, where civilians are at risk, or in Khartoum, I'm just thinking aloud, and then expand the mission to become bigger. But you can also use the models as a way of scaling down missions. You have MONUSCO, large multidimensional mission, but you may decide that at a later stage, when conditions are ripe, that MONUSCO become a DDR or an SSR mission, for instance. So you can use the models in different ways as an entry point, but also as a way of preparing the exit of a mission. And I think the models are important because countries are, even though they have needs, there are many countries that need peacekeepers, but they are reluctant to get missions in because the fear of having a large multidimensional mission, because of that fear and the feeling that maybe their sovereignty would be infringed upon. And by having these narrow models dealing with specific issues, you can make countries more confident that they can get missions that deal with a specific issue. Obviously, there are other issues that need to be dealt with, but not necessarily by the UN if political conditions are not ripe. But at least you can make countries far more confident that when missions come, they are dealing with the specific priority determined by that government. And of course, we can build on that to expand the mission if there is willingness to do so. If not, other entities and other actors have to take up the job. I stop it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I was just wanting to address that, frankly speaking. I'm well aware I'm standing between everybody and their coffee. So I'll keep this very short. But I think the interventions and also particularly the responses to the questions have not only shown that this is a very timely debate, but I think have also shown how complex the situation is we're in. This is not something which can be glossed over, if I may say so, in diplomatic fashion. The world has changed. And no matter what we think we want, we will really have to see whether we can do it and how we can do it. And I think it is indeed a very, and it goes to your question, Zaman. I think we really need to have a very frank and blunt assessment of where we are. We will perhaps have to think about not only, and I think Addis is a good place for doing so. We may have to think about not only the UN concept of peacekeeping, and I think it was good to be reminded that peacekeeping actually means that there is a peace to keep, and we have to be real about missions, mission definition, and particularly mission creep, if I may say so. But perhaps even more importantly, we may have to also think about the role, the stronger role, and I think the AU is taking an important lead here, the important role of regional organizations when it comes to peacekeeping operations as well. I think the debate we're having on 2719, I think is and the difficulties is an indication of that. Financing, as always in life, money is what makes it all happen. But I think we may have to sort of also start thinking more in that direction if we run into a situation where the recent announcements in New York have indicated challenges for the established system and perhaps the regional approach. And I think my understanding when talking to AU officials is that they are actually looking at this. And I think the fundamental approach, African solutions for African problems, which after all is what the AU has so strongly advocated for, is a path we should look at. So yes, I think the debate in Berlin will be indeed very timely, and I think it will be hopefully a good opportunity to address and assess the situation. As I said, regrettably, and I think Germany will continue to remain committed to its engagements. There's little doubt about that. But nevertheless, the world is changing, and we have to really have a hard look at what is ahead of us. Thank you.
This is just one final round. If anybody has a questions, comments, not me, I just throw a question both to representatives of the member states here, but also in the room, mainly in terms of reflecting on the feasibility of applying these models in the current context of UN Security Council. We heard from the authors how the models, they make a very persuasive argument how they can be applied and in various contexts. But it's also good to hear from the member states in the room the feasibility of applying these models in real life situations. Another, perhaps as part of their final comment, would be something to reflect in terms of how these models fit into the whole discussion around a spectrum of peace operations. You've already touched about it when you were talking about transition into different forms. So maybe let's just see if there is, okay.
Thank you all for your information. First, the easy question. How many peacekeeping missions are in the 50 countries? And then the hard question is, particularly in DRC, Somalia, Sudan, just what are some of your observations on why it is, what's holding up the peacemakers in making peace?
Respond now, yeah. So if I heard you correctly about the numbers of peace operations, so there's about a dozen UN missions at the moment currently deployed around the world, but the total number deployed since 1947 is just over 120, about 125 actually, and those 125 have deployed in 50 or so, I think it's 54 different countries around the world, since 1947. Related sort of point is that the UN artificially distinguishes between peacekeeping missions and special political missions, but that's not a distinction that we found analytically helpful, or hence we don't really refer to that much in the study. And then on why the peacemakers find it so difficult, I wish we knew, right? But I think there's a couple of key reasons there. One, I think, is the legacy of the war on terror discourse, and the silly notion that you can't or shouldn't negotiate with people you define as terrorists. I think that has been a very unhelpful just lexicon and discourse. We negotiated with all sorts of terrible groups that did terrible things in the 1980s civil wars, the 1990s civil wars, and we made peace, and we made, governments of national unity with our enemies. And that's what you've got to do with peace. You can't make it with your friends, you've got to make it with your enemies. And that means you've got to talk to them, as Mr. Wan said, with dialogue. So the first thing I think is we get rid of that sort of war on terror legacy. We stop sort of criminalizing and putting the terrorist label on group. In most wars, most sides use terror tactics at some stage, right? And so we shouldn't have that as a reason not to engage in dialogue. And then the second reason I think that they're struggling is people aren't putting the resources, either the financial or the political muscle, behind peacemaking and mediation. They're putting money and resources and political muscle into enforcement and military intervention and building up militaries and defense budgets. They're not putting equivalent, political muscle and financing behind mediation support capabilities, behind peacemaking efforts. And relatively, they're a lot cheaper. I left actually just as I was getting on the plane to come from Washington. The US Institute of Peace, right, which is the congressionally mandated institute to try and do these peace building things, was forcibly entered into by the Elon Musk Doge, right? The board of USIP forcibly pushed out of the building and fired. So this is why peacemaking is going to be difficult if we're literally getting rid of the peacemakers and the mediators. Those are my 2 cents.
Just maybe just in response to your question, I think we need, and we are in an African context, and I know as a matter of fact, and I think we should even take responsibility for it, at least when I was at the AU, I think that's when we deployed most of the AU operations in CAR, in Mali, in Somalia, in Burundi, and the smaller ones in Comoros. In Eastern DRC, people even forget we had a small observer mission there. In South Sudan, we had a mission deployed in South Sudan to look at LRA, government of Uganda, cessation facility agreement, and so on. And I think we place a lot of focus on missions. And one can understand it because AU and the global community failed to stop the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. And when the PSC protocol was formulated, obviously, that was in the back of our minds that we needed African capabilities to intervene whenever there is a need for an intervention, because there you had a UN mission, but unfortunately, the Security Council decided to scale down the mission. And then later on, to face situations in Darfur, where indeed you had atrocities going on, that for many people amounted to genocide in Darfur, obviously there was a need to do something. And then the AU deployed a small mission, starting with few observers, and then troops from Rwanda and Nigeria, 300, 150, 150 for each. And then we did Somalia, and then we did CAR. And of course, we did Burundi before that, which was taken over by the UN. So there was a trend of responding to most of the conflict situations through the deployment of missions. And those missions were useful. They did a good work, even though they had their own limitations. But I believe in the process, I'm speaking about the time I was at the AU, we lost sight of the fact that when you read the PSC protocol, the key in the PSC protocol is not really peace support mission. The key in the PSC protocol is prevention and mediation. And you have to read the PSC protocol, read the principle, the objective. The key in the PSC protocol is prevention and mediation. And in our work, we did not keep that balance between peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and prevention and mediation. We lost sight of it, in my view. And we lost sight of it, and we need, I think, going forward, AU member states need really to go back to that balance between peacekeeping, which remains important, mediation and prevention, which are in actual fact even more important, because where they succeed, there will be no need to deploy expensive missions, that the AU cannot finance anyway. And by the way, when you look at the Cairo Declaration of June 1993 that created the AU Mechanism for Conflict Prevention, Management and Resolution, the head of state then decided that the AU should not go into large peacekeeping missions, and read it, it's written. They said, because if we succeed in mediation and prevention, we will be spared of the need to deploy large missions for which we don't have the necessary funding. I think we need to restore that balance. And one practical example, when you do mediation in a sustained fashion, it has a tremendous impact. And I give one example, which is not sufficient in my view talking about, but I understand the book is coming out, yeah, I'm done, coming out this year about it, is the AUHIP, the AU High-Level Implementation Panel, which was led by President Beki, comprising late President Buyoya and President Abdulsalami Abubakar. This was the most sustained mediation effort ever undertaken by the AU. It started with an AU panel on Darfur, then evolved into AUHIP. And they achieved successful cessation between Sudan and South Sudan. They did a number of mediation efforts within Sudan, and it costed little when you compare it to a peacekeeping mission. So yes, I agree with you, Paul. We need to go back to mediation and prevention, and the EU has the tools. The challenge is implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any last word? Thank you very much. Please give a round of applause to our speakers. I think it's but let me just say one word. So from what we heard, so it's not the end of history when it comes to peacekeeping. Borrowing the word from Fukuyama, is just one milestone in the long history. So that's one. And secondly, the current phase is more of an exception than a norm in the longer lifetime of peacekeeping. And let's continue engaging with the debate and discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So a well-deserved tea, coffee, health break for all of us. Once again, thank you very much, particularly to David for excellently moderating this excellent panel. Thank you to the members of the panel as well. Please enjoy the coffee.